There is a feeling that almost no one can accurately describe, but that many people carry in silence. It's not exactly sadness, it's not anxiety in the clinical sense of the term. It's more of a subtle dissonance between what life seems to be on the outside and what it seems to be on the inside. It's the feeling of being present in everything and at the same time slightly absent from oneself, of functioning well, of meeting expectations, of receiving compliments, of being perceived as someone who has everything under control, and yet of waking up some days with a nameless question that no one around could understand. You have lost nothing, no one has died, nothing has visibly collapsed, and yet something within you is agitated in a way that is not calmed by rest or distraction, or by more planning or productivity. It's as if the life you lead is in every measurable way a good life, and at the same time, a life that is not entirely your own. Carl Jung spent decades sitting on the other side of a desk, listening to people who didn't come to him with broken lives. They came with functional, organized, well-constructed lives that had ceased to make sense, not all at once, but gradually, like a radio frequency that goes out of tune so slowly that you only realize it when the static has already invaded everything. What Jung observed in these people was not a breakdown, but the psyche sending signals, specific, recognizable, and, according to him, almost universal signals that appear before one of the most significant changes a human being can go through. The problem is that these signals are almost never recognized when they occur. We mistake them for fatigue, a crisis, a failure, a lack of gratitude for the life we have. And because they are misinterpreted, most people react in the wrong way, not because they are weak or lack courage, but because no one has ever told them what these signals really mean. This video was made to say that, to name precisely what you may be experiencing right now and why. According to Jung, the period that seems the most destabilizing in a life is often precisely the prelude to the most authentic chapter that life has ever known. If you recognize in yourself the 4 signs that we are going to explore here, what you are feeling is not a sign that something has gone wrong. This is a sign that something is trying to be born. There is one thing that research in developmental psychology has consistently revealed over the past few decades. People who go through profound psychological transformations rarely describe them, in retrospect, as experiences that began with enthusiasm or clarity. Psychologist James Hollis, one of the most respected contemporary specialists in Jungian thought and author of works such as The Unlived Life, has documented over decades of clinical work that the most significant psychic transitions in adult life often begin with what he has called a feeling of shrinking, the perception that life shrinks on the inside, even though on the outside it continues to expand. This feeling is not accompanied by an explanation. It is not accompanied by a clear event that justifies what you are feeling. It simply appears, and since it has no obvious cause, it is baffling. Because when there is no obvious cause, the mind looks for where the problem lies, and almost always concludes that the problem is you, that you should be more grateful. You are difficult to please, that there is something wrong with your ability to be happy with what you have. Jung would say something else. Jung would say that the mind that feels this narrowing is not defective. He is reacting to something real. The psyche possesses its own intelligence, older and more precise than immediate consciousness. And when this intelligence determines that the structure in which you live has already completed its cycle, it begins to communicate it in the only way it has available, through symptoms, agitation, a void that does not respond to usual remedies. What we call signals here are not weaknesses. These are messages, and learning to distinguish a message from a problem is perhaps the most important psychological skill an adult can develop. Carl Jung did not construct his theory of the human psyche in university offices disconnected from real life. He built it alongside patients over decades of clinical listening in Zurich. He tested it against his own inner experience during a period of personal rupture, which he described in detail in the writings that make up the Red Book. What emerged from this process is one of the most elaborate structures ever created to understand human psychological life. And at the heart of this structure lies a concept that Jung called individuation. Individuation is not a fancy word for personal development. It's not about becoming the best version of yourself in the sense that productivity platforms use that expression. It is something more specific, more demanding, and, according to Jung, rarer. Individuation is the process by which a person gradually and consciously detaches themselves from the collective identifications that have shaped their psyche since childhood, family expectations, cultural patterns, and roles that they have internalized before having the vocabulary to question them, and begins to live from what Jung called the self, the deepest and most authentic center of the individual personality. This process is not linear. It doesn't follow a schedule, and it almost never starts in a way that seems positive. It usually begins with what Jung identified as a dissolution of the structures that the ego has built, a feeling that what used to work has stopped working, that the map you used to navigate your life no longer fits the territory you find yourself in. The first sign of this process is what Jung described in his clinical writings as the emptying of psychic libido from established structures. In more direct terms, things that previously made sense cease to make sense, not dramatically, not through an emotional collapse that everyone around you perceives, but silently and progressively, as if an electric current that animated certain areas of your life was being redirected to another place, a place that you cannot yet identify because it does not yet have a form. You continue to do what you were doing. You keep showing up, you continue to give. But something that used to drive it all, a motivation you didn't need to look for because it was simply there, began to be missing. The goals you pursued with such genuine energy now seem to exist more as obligations than as impulses. The milestones you imagined celebrating have arrived, have been celebrated, and the feeling that remains is strangely less strong than you expected. The conversations that were supposed to energize you end up draining you. Projects that were supposed to satisfy you end up leaving a question that you don't know how to formulate. Researcher Amy Rzizniewski of Yale University has conducted extensive studies on what she has called changes in the meaning of work throughout adult life, and her data reveal that a significant proportion of people who report this type of emptiness do not suffer from burnout in the clinical sense of the term. They experience what she described as a gap between their current identity, and their emerging identity, a state in which the person has outgrown the structure in which they are evolving, but has not yet identified the next structure that corresponds to what they are becoming. Jung would have recognized him immediately. He wrote in Psychological Types, published in 1921, that libido, which he conceived as a general psychic energy, is directed towards what the psyche recognizes as necessary for development. When she withdraws from a structure, it is not because that structure was bad. That's because she has already accomplished what she had to accomplish. This withdrawal is a sign that growth must happen elsewhere. The problem is that this elsewhere does not yet exist in a visible way, and the absence of a visible destination is interpreted by the ego as a pure loss, when in reality it is a preparation. The second sign is more disturbing and harder to ignore. It is the emergence of what was buried, of dreams that carry an emotional charge disproportionate to the story they contain, of memories that surface uninvited, of periods you thought you had already assimilated, of emotions that arrive without apparent trigger, of sadness that appears on an ordinary day, without identifiable reason, of anger that arises in a situation that does not fully justify it, of tears that flow in the middle of a banal moment and that do not fade easily. Jung called this the activity of the unconscious, when conscious identity begins to lose its firmness, when the ego no longer supports with such conviction the narrative of who you are and what you want. The material that was compressed under this narrative begins to rise to the surface, not because something has gone wrong, but because there is finally room for it to happen. For Jung, the unconscious was not a passive repository of repressed memories. It was an active system with its own logic, intentions, and sense of direction that often conflicted with what the ego had planned. What emerges during this period is not random, it is specific. These are the parts of yourself that were set aside because they didn't fit with the persona that had to be constructed. The persona, the concept Jung developed to describe the social mask we all construct to function in society, is a necessary structure. You need a persona to navigate the world. The problem isn't having it. The problem arises when the persona is confused with the self, when you forget you were wearing a mask and start to believe that the mask is your face. Clinical psychologist and researcher Dan McAdams of Northwestern University has spent decades studying adult life stories and has highlighted a consistent pattern. People who go through profound identity transitions often report a period during which old and seemingly resolved emotional elements resurface with renewed intensity. McAdams interpreted this not as a regression, but as what he called a narrative revision, the process by which the psyche reconstructs the sense of identity from a deeper level requires access to material that had been left aside. Jung described a similar phenomenon in the psychology of the unconscious and in various other writings throughout his career. He observed that when the psyche begins to reorganize itself around a more authentic center, it calls upon what had been excluded, not to punish, but to integrate all that has been left out of the conscious narrative, the drives that seemed incompatible with the persona, the needs that have been stifled by pragmatism, the abilities that have been discarded because they did not seem practical in the context in which you grew up. All of this is starting to exert pressure from within. And this pressure resembles emotional instability. It gives the impression that something is wrong, whereas in reality, it is the process of plenitude that is at work. The third sign is related to what Jung described as the need for withdrawal that accompanies periods of internal transformation, a need for solitude that is neither melancholy nor pathological isolation, but a requirement of the psyche for an inner space. You begin to feel that certain social interactions that once seemed natural now cost you something you cannot afford to give. You cancel appointments without being able to explain why, because the reason is not visible. It has no socially acceptable name. You simply know that you need more space than you have, that being in noisy environments or having superficial conversations leaves you feeling emptier than before, rather than fulfilled. Researchers in affective neuroscience have found that states of deep emotional processing significantly increase the cognitive and energy demands of the nervous system. The research team of neuroscientist Antonio Damasio at the University of Southern California has demonstrated that states of deep emotional reorganization activate neural networks that typically compete with social engagement, meaning that when the psyche is doing large-scale internal work, the organism truly has fewer resources for external engagement. This is not a weakness. It is biology serving the process. Jung understood this intuitively, long before neuroscience had the tools to measure it. He described in several of his clinical writings that periods of greater introversion in an adult's life often coincide with periods of greater internal activity, and that attempting to force social engagement during these periods not only exhausts the person, but actively interferes with the ongoing reorganization process. The need for silence is not a symptom of depression. It is sometimes the psychological equivalent of the rest the body needs after surgery. Something is happening internally. The system needs calm so that the work can be accomplished. The fourth sign is the most difficult to name and therefore the most often misinterpreted. It is the arrival of a specific type of worry, not the diffuse worry of someone who is overworked, nor the anxiety that responds to identifiable threats, but something different, a dissatisfaction that is not rooted in any specific circumstance of your current life. The feeling that there is a version of your experience to which you do not have access, not because external conditions are unfavorable, but because something within you has not yet found expression. Jung identified this as the most direct sign of the presence of what he called unlived life. In writings spanning decades of his work, he repeatedly returned to the idea that the human psyche carries, alongside the life a person lives, a set of possibilities that have never been realized, drives that have been repressed, capacities that have been discarded, aspects of the personality that have been put aside because they did not fit into the structure that needed to be built. This unlived life does not disappear. It remains active in the unconscious, exerting pressure, and Jung was explicit in describing where this pressure manifests itself. In the projections we make onto others, envying with a specificity that makes no sense, the aspects of their lives that touch precisely on what we have never allowed ourselves. This anxiety, without apparent cause, arises on days when objectively everything is fine. with the feeling that there is a deeper question that your current life is not answering, without you being able to formulate what this question is. James Hollis, drawing on decades of clinical work grounded in the Jungian tradition, wrote in The Unlived Life that the most common suffering he encountered in adults was not that caused by trauma, but that caused by the accumulation of small choices that had been made against the self. Decisions that seemed reasonable, responsible, realistic, and that were made based on what was expected, what was safe, what avoided conflicts, what allowed to retain the approval of people whose love seemed conditional. The accumulation of these choices over years or decades creates what Hollis described as the debt to the self, a bill that the psyche eventually demands, not as a punishment, but as a plea. When the four signs appear together, the emptiness of what previously had meaning, the emergence of what was submerged, the need for withdrawal, and the specific anxiety of life not lived, what is happening is not a crisis. It's a call. The psyche lets us know that the first chapter, the one built from heritage, expectation, and necessary adaptation, has accomplished what it had to accomplish, and that a next chapter awaits us, not in the distant future, not after circumstances have changed, but now, in this very moment of dissolution and uncertainty. Jung described this as the threshold, the point between what has been and what has not yet taken form. And he was very clear about what determines whether a person crosses that threshold or falls back. It is not willpower. It is not optimism. It is the ability to tolerate disorientation without filling the void with the first familiar thing that comes along. If what Jung described about the individuation process, this unlived life that begins to exert pressure from within, this intelligence of the psyche that moves towards what is authentic, even before we have the words to name it, resonates with something you recognize in your own experience. The LUZ method was developed to transform this recognition into concrete action. In just 5 minutes a day, you begin to create the kind of inner space the psyche needs to reveal what is trying to emerge without you needing to force, plan, or have a clear vision before you begin. The link is pinned in the comments, and the QR code is displayed on the screen right now. There is a way in which these 4 signs manifest themselves within oneself that is difficult to describe to someone else, but those who experience them immediately recognize them. When someone names them precisely, it's waking up some days with a feeling of heaviness that has no cause, not an event that happened, not a specific concern, just a different gravity in the early hours of the morning before the slightest thought has had time to organize itself. You stay in bed for a few more minutes because getting out of bed seems to require more effort than before, and you know that it makes no rational sense because nothing has objectively changed. It's sitting at a family meal in a conversation you've had hundreds of times with people you genuinely love and feeling slightly out of place in relation to it all, as if there were a half-second delay between what is happening around you and your presence there. You respond, you participate, but a part of you is elsewhere, trying to listen to something that comes from no identifiable direction. It's ending a day where you've been productive, useful, and present for others, and feeling a fatigue that doesn't correspond to physical effort, a fatigue that doesn't come from the body, but from another level. as if maintaining the version of yourself that the world knows requires more energy than before. Not because that version is false, but because it's becoming too small for what you're becoming. It is seeing someone living with a particular kind of freedom. Not freedom in general, not a perfect life, but a particular quality in the way that person inhabits their own existence, makes decisions, seems in tune with something you cannot name, and to feel a pang that isn't exactly jealousy. It's something heavier, a kind of recognition that there is an experience you have not yet had access to. Not because external conditions have prevented you, but because something within you has never gone that far. It's sending someone a text message to tell them what you really think about something important and deleting it before sending it. Not because it's inappropriate, but because it says something true about what you feel, and you don't yet know what to do with that truth, as long as it belongs only to you. It's like having a dream whose plot you forget in a few minutes, but which leaves an emotional imprint that you carry with you all day. A feeling for which there are no words, but which seems more real than many things that happen when you are awake. It is being completely alone in a moment of silence that should be a rest, and feeling the presence of a question you have not asked. Not a question about the future, a question about whether the life you lead in its entirety, with everything you have built in it, is the life you came here to live. You don't phrase it that way. It does not present itself with such clarity. It arrives like a formless unease, like an empty space at the center of something that appears full according to all other criteria. But anyone who has experienced this knows what it's like. He knows it's not depression. Even if it looks like depression some days, he knows it's not ingratitude. Even if the voice of inner judgment uses that word, he knows it's something else, something waiting to be recognized. And the hardest part is not what you feel, it's the silence that surrounds what you feel. The lack of language in everyday conversations to talk about it. The impossibility of explaining to someone who is comfortably settled in the first chapter of their own life what it means to be on the threshold. Because from the outside, everything seems to be fine, and inside, something is undergoing a change that you did not choose and that you do not know how to name. The cost of continuing to fail to recognize these signs for what they are is not an abstract cost. It has a shape, it has a specific weight. It is the silent accumulation of decisions made based on what was expected, what was safe, what avoided confrontation, and not based on what was true. Each of these decisions, taken in isolation, seems reasonable, but taken together, over months and years, they create a gap between who you are and who you give the impression of being. A gap that widens, that requires more and more energy to maintain, that becomes more and more costly as you pretend it doesn't exist. It's that persistent feeling of living a parallel life to the one that should be yours, of being present at everything, and at the same time absent from something essential. This cost does not appear all at once. It manifests itself as a fatigue that does not disappear with the holidays, as an irritability without apparent cause, as a growing difficulty in being moved by things that previously touched you, like the gradual onset of emotional numbness that you begin to mistake for maturity. Jung was direct about what happens when a person reaches the threshold and backs away. He described in clinical writings and in correspondence that has been preserved and studied the specific weight of a psyche that has reverted to the structure it was trying to overcome. It is not the weight of failure. It is the weight of knowing that you came close enough to feel what was on the other side and then chose what is familiar. This weight is different from all the others. It does not lessen with time, it intensifies. But the awareness you are experiencing right now, the simple act of naming what you are feeling, of stopping trying to fix the signals and starting to listen to them, is already a movement. This is already a turning point. Not towards the other side of the threshold, because that doesn't happen in an instant, but in the right direction, towards the direction where the psyche can begin to reorganize itself around something truer than what has been inherited. The turning point is not a dramatic decision. This is not a visible break with what existed before. It is internal. This is the difference between interpreting signals as problems to be solved and recognizing them as the intelligence of your psyche, trying to guide you where you need to go. This difference in interpretation changes everything, not the immediate external circumstances, the quality of the relationship you have with yourself, and from this quality, over time, everything else emerges. If you feel that the time has come to stop interpreting your own worry as a flaw and start listening to it as information, not because life has turned upside down, but because something inside you recognizes that there is a next step that is more real than any step you have taken so far. The LU's method was created for this specific passage. In just 5 minutes a day, you begin to develop the ability to listen to what your psyche is communicating to you, to distinguish noise from signal, to create the kind of relationship with your inner world that transforms recognition into direction. This is not a generic self-knowledge program. It is a practice based on the same principles that Jung spent his life developing, adapted to those who are at the dawn of this change and not to those who study the subject from afar. The link is pinned in the comments and the QR code is displayed on the screen right now. I am asking you a question here, and I want you to keep it in mind in all honesty. You don't need to answer it now, but don't put it aside. Of the 4 signs we explored in this video, which one do you recognize most accurately in your life? Not as something that happened in the past, but as something that is present. Write it in the comments, just the sign, in a single line, because sometimes putting words to what was only inside is the first step in a transformation that doesn't yet have a name. If this video touched on something you're not used to seeing named with such clarity, like it, not as an automatic gesture for the channel, but because someone you know may be experiencing exactly what has been described here, without having the words to express it, without knowing that what they feel has a structure, a direction, a meaning. The like allows this video to reach that person. She probably won't be looking for it, but when she finds it, she'll recognize it. Think of someone you know who carries within them an unnamed worry that appears to be functioning well, and whom you know with that intimacy that only exists between people who truly know each other, is going through something difficult to explain. Share this video with this person, not with a long comment, just the video. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone is to give them a language to express what they already feel. And if you wish to delve deeper into what has been discussed here, if Jungian psychology and the intelligence of the unconscious are part of the path you wish to follow, register, not to do the channel a favor, but to have continuous access to a type of conversation that deepens with each video. Because this work does not end with a single meeting. It deepens, and you deserve to continue.